sign in on computer and can't hear anything, make sure you select call using computer as an option to listen in. If you still can't hear anything, call the 1-855 number. So I'll just repeat it for everyone. 1-855-797-9485 and use the access code 662-4818. And we'll type this in the chat box as well. Unfortunately, we can't really assist with troubleshooting issues as we go along, but the webinar will be recorded and posted on our website afterwards as well under our training page. We will have an opportunity at the end for questions, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we'll do our best to ensure we answer all of them. Just that our next webinar is on February 22nd, and we'll feature Heather Sargent from Georgian Bay Forever discussing their Phragmites in water removal project. Registration will be sent later today or tomorrow. All right, we're going to get started. This presentation will highlight key sections of the new Act and will provide an overview of the Ministry's current approach to invasive species in Ontario. So Jeremy Down is our presenter today, and he is the Invasive Species Policy Program Advisor with the MRS. He was a member of the team that developed the new Act, which came into force this past November 2016. He is currently leading the development of policies and regulations required to support the implementation of the Act and has been with the Ministry since 2006. All right, I'll pass it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Kelly. Hello, everyone. Kelly mentioned I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of the kind of some of the key sections of the new Invasive Species Act and talk a little bit about how we approach invasive species generally in Ontario. He says you can hear us. I think we're good.
Okay.
How much to the next?
Sorry about that. Oh, just.
A little background or kind of current status on invasive species in Ontario. So based on the current numbers that we have, Ontario has the privilege of having more invasive species than any other Canadian province or territory. The latest numbers estimate there's around 440 known invasive plants in southern Ontario alone. There's 180 non-native and invasive species in the Great Lakes, and just to distinguish there, natives that aren't necessarily invasive in all circumstances. So there is, a degree of impact that kind of crosses that line between the non-native species that here and those that we would consider invasive species going forward. And so not all non-native species in the Great Lakes are considered invasive. There needs to be 39 known or potential forest insects that we're concerned about in Ontario, and around 10 known potential tree diseases. So if you think about the emerald ash borers and the butternut cankers out there, those are some of the things we're concerned about there. In terms of why Ontario is at risk and why we have the number of invasive species that we have, so obviously there's significant international trade connections with Ontario, provide multiple pathways of entry, both through the Great Lakes, through air travel, through vehicular movement, to the U.S. and beyond. This is a significant factor in terms of the introduction, and it provides a pathway for a large number of invasive species to come from other jurisdictions. And in Ontario in particular, there's a significant amount of degraded natural habitat, and so I think we're aware that in those areas, once disturbed, it provides easy access for invasive species to move in and establish. With a diverse geography and climate, so if you think about the Carolinian forest in the south, all the way to the boreal forest and the peatlands of the north, a wide range of habitat provides opportunity for a wide range of species from around the globe to be introduced and established here. And then there's concerns around climate change, that as we move forward, the potential warming or predicted warming, little species that we previously thought were unable to survive in Ontario due to our cold conditions in the winter, may be able to survive in the north as well as some species may be able to move further north in the province as we go forward. So we currently manage invasive species in Ontario. There's 4 key components. So the most significant is the partnerships that we have established, and so the partnership we have with the Invasive Plant Council is one of those. We also have established partnerships with the Invasive Species Centre in Sault Ste. Marie and Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters here in Peterborough as well. And really focus on the education and outreach side of the equation for us, as well as providing some of the reporting and technical work for us as we go along. We also rely on collaboration, so it's recognized that isn't a single jurisdiction issue. It's not something that Ontario can deal with on its own. So we do have established working groups and partnerships both federally and internationally, and in particular within the Great Lakes watershed. Perspective, the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan was put out in 2012, and that really highlights the challenges and gaps that exist with respect to invasive species management in Ontario, and provides a number of actions or outcomes that the province should be working towards in terms of addressing the broad issue. MNRF also has a biodiversity, it's in our nature document, and that really is kind of a driver for MNRF and its implementation. And there are some deliverables, actions identified in that strategy that, again, relate to invasive species. The piece is legislation, so we now have the new Ontario Invasive Species Act. As well, the federal government put out the Canada Aquatic Invasive Species Regulations recently that deal with some of the aquatics, the Asian carps and the snakehead, for example. This is where we're at with the Act itself. So both the Act and the regulation took effect on November 3rd of 2016. The Act was passed back in 2015, but there was a one-year gap in terms of when it passed versus when it came into force. If you want to read the Act, it's a really great evening read. You can find it on the website, or you can Google it through eLaws Ontario. As well, we recently posted a decision notice on a policy document that provides guidance on how we're going to proceed with assessing the risk posed by invasive species for the purpose of informing regulatory decisions. And so that document is available online, and it provides, basically a six-step process at a very high level in terms of how the government intends to, identify the risk associated with species and how we intend to use that information to inform potential regulatory action for those species going forward. So back to drafting the Act, there were a few key principles that were identified, and the first was the idea around prevention first. So I think all known that the idea of keeping invasive species out as well as preventing their spread are much more cost effective than dealing with those that are already here and well established and have significant impacts. The idea really is to provide tools that allow us to prevent new introductions as well as to prevent the spread, while also providing flexibility to deal with those ones that are well established here in the province now. It is science-based in terms of how we're going to proceed with implementation. So despite the fact that we don't have a similar mechanism as you see under the Endangered Species Act or the Federal Species at Risk Act, being CSIRO or CSIWIC, we are basing those decisions on science, and we still are consulting with relevant experts for those species. The legislation itself requires us at a minimum to consider the species' biological characteristics, the risk harm to the natural environment, the dispersability of that species, as well as the socio-economic impacts of that species if it were to arrive or spread in Ontario. And indeed, the policy paper that I just mentioned speaks how we intend to work through that process. The legislation itself is an enabling framework, and that's really how modern legislation is now being drafted. So instead of having a number of prescriptive or shall do type of statements, the legislation really provides a framework and mechanisms or powers that allow us to deal with the various management objectives for invasive species around prevention, detection, control, and eradication. It allows us to both implement those through the government as well as through partners and through the public. So it really is focused on providing the mechanisms to deal with invasive species, and again, as we continue to go forward, we're looking at how to effectively use those. It also is on shared accountability. So as I mentioned, it's clear that MNRF and the Ontario government can't address this issue by itself. So it does provide the ability for us to not only enhance the existing partnerships that we have, it provides the mechanisms to enter into new partnerships, as the authority to delegate some of the powers in the legislation to others. So an example that has been discussed, but again, would require significant discussion and policy work, the idea around using municipal weed inspectors as individuals under this legislation. It provides around cost recovery, so allows us to recover expenses that result from infractions. So if a person's found guilty of introducing an invasive species, the government spends a significant amount of money trying to control or eradicate that. There's powers in the legislation that allow us to recover costs from the guilty individual. It also recognizes the need for intergovernment cooperation, so there is a significant role for the federal government in invasive species management and prevention, and the idea is that we're going to use this legislation to complement and fill gaps with respect to the federal jurisdiction as we go forward. Act defines invasive species, so it can address species that are either not native to Ontario or to parts of Ontario, and harming the natural environment or is likely to harm the natural environment. So it allows us to deal with species that are both not here today, as well as species that may already be here, and it allows us to deal with species that may be native to one part of Ontario but not native to another. So, species from southern Ontario that's introduced into northern Ontario, for example. It's broad in terms of what it encompasses, so we can deal with plants, organisms, microorganisms, animals, as there is that potential or known impact of the natural environment. So the idea here is that we won't be focusing on things that are purely agricultural pests or exotic, pets, for example, that don't have an impact on the natural environment. It recognizes that there are, certain species that cross boundaries, and again, we will work with the other, ministries, organizations if those species become of concern. So regulating invasive species. So just to reiterate those considerations that are outlined in the Act, but essentially the legislation provides for two classes. The first is prohibited, the second being restricted. Hopefully it's pretty clear with the species that would be regulated as prohibited. Essentially you can no longer have them in Ontario, or you can't bring them into Ontario in forward. No person shall bring into Ontario, possess, transport, propagate, buy, sell, lease, or trade. In terms of restricted species, the intent of this class is to address the species that are already here. It allows for the recognition of the interaction that individuals or the public or organizations may already be having with some of the established or introduced species. And automatic prohibitions in the legislation are that you can't bring those into provincial parks and conservation reserves, and that the species can't be deposited or released in Ontario. So again, trying to avoid new introductions and spread. As well, the flexibility to apply any additional prohibitions that are available for the prohibited class to the restricted class. So when we look at the first set of species we regulated back in November, you'll see that we select a number of the additional prohibitions that have been applied to the species in the restricted class. And so the idea here is to give us some flexibility to tailor not only the classification but the prohibitions in accordance with the management objectives of that species. So if it's keeping it out versus trying to prevent spread versus trying to eradicate or eliminate that species from the province. So in terms of additional powers, so I fully admit in all cases government doesn't always move fast and regulations can take some time. And so we recognize in drafting legislation that there may be circumstances where we don't want to have to wait 1 or 2 years that it may require us to go through the risk assessment, the process, the consultation process, the regulatory development process, and approvals. We provided a mechanism for the minister to temporarily designate an invasive species under the legislation for a period of up to 2 years. And I pick on mountain pine beetle here because everybody knows it's a really bad invasive species that has potential to be introduced into Ontario, and if it were introduced, the impacts would not be insignificant. Again, we haven't yet regulated mountain pine beetle. If it were to show up in northwestern Ontario this summer, the minister could invoke this power, and that would therefore allow us to apply the powers available for prohibited species in the Act to deal with mountain pine beetle in that case. So again, only putting in place restrictions and prohibitions, but also using the control and eradication powers that exist in the legislation. For a maximum of 2 years, and during that period, we would then, proceed with the risk assessment, regulatory development, and consultation processes as required. The ability to regulate carriers. So these are essentially the pathways or the mechanisms that invasive species may move from one place to another. So common examples are, boats, bait, firewood, horticultural plants, and soils, etc. Again, it allows us to put in place restrictions on how those things may be moved. So, the common that's discussed nowadays is the idea of requiring, recreational watercraft to have all vegetation removed when they're removed from the water, as well as the water drained from, live wells or bilges or whatever exists on those boats. We also need to put in place invasive species control areas. So this is a mechanism that allows us to regulate or put in restrictions or prohibitions based on geography. And we can either with the intent of keeping an invasive species from spreading from an area or spreading into an area. Again, it allows us broad flexibility. And start to look at how all these powers up. There may be some overlap, but again, that's intentional in terms of when we look at the species and the impacts and the concerns, it allows us to really tailor the regulatory and management approach based on how we think we can most effectively manage that species going forward. Sometimes when you put in place prohibitions, you may interfere with beneficial or good actions or actions that are necessary. I allowed three mechanisms that would essentially allow us to authorize individuals or organizations, et cetera, to undertake beneficial action. So the first is authorizations, and so the legislation specifically sets out that these can be used for research and education, prevention or eradication actions, or other purpose prescribed in regulation. So in drafting legislation, we already see the future, so we allowed ourselves the flexibility that if other circumstances that arise, we can in regulation increase the ability to use authorizations going forward. The ability to enter into agreements, and traditionally agreements are used, more on an organizational basis, longer term, multi-year type of project or activity. But we can enter into agreements again for the purposes of prevention, detection, control, eradication activities, monitoring, reporting activities, education and research, doing science or risk assessments on our behalf, as well as prevention of the next mechanism, prevention response plans. Prevention response plans, so again, it's the minister may direct the plan to be prepared. The idea here is that, this can either be, I guess the high-end model is the Asian carp response plan. That's, an extremely thick binder and outlines everybody's role with respect to if an Asian carp arrives in Ontario and how the response would proceed, to the simpler version in terms of best management practices or how to effectively remove and control invasive species. The idea here is that we can use these plans and we can essentially, if there's something that the general public or a select number of individuals can do that we know is an accepted and suitable method for control or eradicating an invasive species, we can put those in the plans, and essentially, as long as the conditions of the plan are followed, an authorization or agreement would not be required, to be in compliance with the Act. So, for example, one we're looking at right now is water soldier, which is an aquatic plant that's present in the Trent River east of Peterborough here. It was prohibited in November. There are waterfront landowners, property owners that do go and do hand removal of that plant. The programs say you can't possess or transport that plant, so the state of the world today right now would make it so that individual can't go in their waterfront and remove that plant. What we are doing is working on a prevention response plan that would say as long as you do it, following these steps at this time of year, activity can proceed. Allows or avoids the need for complicated regulatory exceptions, also need to issue authorizations on a case-by-case or individual basis. So it really allows a broad mechanism for us to allow what would be prohibited activities to proceed. So in terms of dealing with the broad intent around detection, response, and control, so there are powers provided for both inspectors and enforcement officers, as well as to the minister, to deal with those activities. It also provides the authority for the minister to appoint a person or class of persons as inspectors in addition to enforcement officers. So now, with legislation, the only individuals that have the inspection powers that are outlined in the legislation are MNRF, conservation officers, and park wardens. But allows us to, as we go forward with implementation, look at areas where it may be appropriate for other individuals to have those, or either a select set of those authorities or all of those authorities. And like I indicated earlier, one of the ones that has been suggested to me is municipal weed inspectors. Another one would be conservation authority staff here in the south. In terms of when we apply the most intrusive power, so there is the authority to go in and damage private property as part of the control or eradication activity. There is a requirement for an inspector or an enforcement officer to seek the minister's authorization prior to proceeding with that action. And as well, there are provisions in the legislation that would allow for compensation to be paid to the affected party in those circumstances. Some of those powers. So in terms of supporting detection activities, we have the ability to do inspections for surveys. Again, this is for the detecting the presence of invasive species or monitoring their spread. So basically, an inspector may go on land, to search or conduct tests, take measurements, leave traps for the purpose of detection of invasive species. It does include buildings and structures, so we could not go in homes, can't go in barns, etc., using these powers. And also, the intent here would be that we would seek landowner permission prior to entering private land. Again, if that permission wasn't granted this would provide the authority for that activity to occur. We also refer to as the unknown species order, and this is a circumstance where an inspector encounters what they believe is an unregulated invasive species, and there's time required to again confirm that it is indeed an invasive species and determine the threat. So an example I have here is, I can't remember the specific pest, but several years ago, a staff person found a pest on a load of Christmas trees. He ordered those trees to not remove those trees and that he'd be back the following day to figure out what to do with them. When he came back the following day, the Christmas trees were all gone. What this would allow us to do is, in those circumstances, would allow the inspector to basically clean or prevent the movement of that thing for up to 15 days. Now, it can't be used in circumstances where it's like, oh, that's an interesting bug, I'm not sure what it is. There has to be some level of certainty that it is an invasive species that maybe is on a watch list, but it's just something we haven't gotten around to regulating yet. So again, Hemlock-woolly adelgid would be a good example. So with mountain pine beetle would be examples for those circumstances. We also have the ability to stop conveyances to inspect. So, you know, a boat, a vehicle, again, things that are capable of moving invasive species, they could stop those if there's reasonable grounds to believe that, you know, an invasive species is being moved around by that conveyance. In terms of compliance, there's also the ability to do inspections to determine compliance. So again, if a person's operating under an authorization agreement, the conditions under a prevention response plan, or that's been made by an inspector, the inspector can make sure that they are compliant with those requirements. And if they're found to be out of compliance, then a compliance order can be issued. And this would be similar mechanisms that exist in the world under the Endangered Species Act that basically says, you know, here's the things you have to do to come back into compliance with the act. Here's the time period you have to do so. So it allows us to work with an individual who may be out of compliance to bring them back into compliance prior to going to the full, you know, the step lane charges, for example. Also have the ability, when supporting control eradication activities, to order declaring land or building or structure as an invaded place. So this is essentially the quarantine power that exists in the legislation. And the objective here is that we can issue an order to either prevent an invasive species from spreading to areas outside of the place, or to control or remove or eradicate the invasive species. So we can proceed with this in terms of a phased approach. So we detect something that we know is an invasive species of either a new significant concern, or it's in a new area of Ontario, and we wonder, you know, nobody is going into that. And so it would apply to a private business operation or something like an ATV trail on Crown land. We use this order power to basically prevent access or things from being removed from those areas. We can also then take measures to remove the invasive species. But keep in mind, if that action does require the damage or destruction of private property, we do have to take that next step and get the minister's approval of those activity. And that triggers a number of other mechanisms in the legislation. I'll mention to folks that, you know, if you think about the number of activities that are already occurring in Ontario, you know, there's control activities occurring for Phragmites, there's control activities occurring for water soldier, European water chestnut, a long list. And in circumstances, we don't need to use, we have to use an order like this to move forward those type of activities. So again, this is not something that we intend to use, you know, on a common basis. It's really for those worst case scenarios, or scenarios where, you know, maybe there's a large public access to an area, or an uncooperative individual or individuals really have to take this next step to be able to achieve the management objectives for that particular area. So on the enforcement side, so again, just to read, the current enforcement officers are the current enforcement mechanism under this legislation. They have the standard suite of enforcement powers that exist under, you know, is common in MNRF and other environmental legislation in Ontario, so they can obtain search warrants, conduct tests, obtain documents, make seizures, make arrests, and issue stop orders. Also, similar to the inspection powers, have the ability to appoint persons or classes of persons as enforcement officers. And so might be some interjurisdictional boundary work. For example, you know, Asian carp in the Great Lakes. Maybe we partner with Michigan or you know, New York State, for example. And what they allow us to do is designate their officers as Ontario enforcement officers for the purpose of this legislation. So again, it increases that flexibility with respect to joint action. Similar thing could occur on the Manitoba border with Manitoba conservation officers. Insignificant, again, that that's intentional given the costs and known impacts that we have with invasive species in Ontario. But bear in mind, the numbers you're seeing are the maximums, and very rarely do we get maximum fines in Ontario, but they are there as a strong deterrent. Maximum fines are $250,000 for individuals, plus imprisonment for up to a year, and $1 million for corporations, and that can be doubled on subsequent offenses. We also have the ability to multiply the fine by the number of animals, plants, or organisms. So, for example, if we set the standard fine for possession of live grass carp at $500, and we catch you with 50 of those grass carp, you can multiply the 500 by 50. If also found out that you were selling those live grass carp, you can go after the individual for the monetary benefit that may have been derived from the sale of those grass carp. In addition, if it was found that the individual released those, and I'm picking on grass carp here, but if they were released into the environment, and we had to spend significant funds trying to eradicate or prevent the spread of those things, I'd also go after the individual for the costs associated with that activity. Obviously, all of this would have to proceed through the court process, etc., but the mechanisms are there should they be needed. So slide, just really high-level summary of the regulation. So the regulation number is Ontario Regulation 35416. Again, you can find it online if you want to look at it in more detail. But this is just a quick summary of the species that have been regulated. So for the prohibited species, the species that were identified on the Conference of Great Lakes, St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers, they keep changing their name, I get it mixed up, back in 2013. So all the U.S. Great Lakes jurisdictions, Ontario and Quebec, got together and they created what they refer to as what's called the Aquatic Least Wanted List. And so these species are represented on that list. They are prohibited species in Ontario. Again, meaning you can't bring them into Ontario, deposit or release them, possess, transport, propagate, buy, sell, or lease. The exception of water soldier, European water chestnut, and unfortunately now recently it was confirmed that grass carp in Lake Erie. None of these species are currently found in Ontario. There are concerns that a couple of them may still be in trade, so parrot feather and hydrilla were species that are used in both the aquarium as well as the water garden trade. So that is something we're working again with our partners getting into the open water season this year to work on education and outreach to make sure folks are aware that they're now prohibited. There are exceptions. So for the 4 species of Asian carp, as well as snakehead and zander, there is a food fish industry associated with those species, so they can still be brought into Ontario and sold if they are dead and eviscerated. So zander is often brought in frozen fillets. That's obviously not a risk to the natural environment, so that can continue. The in-water movement of water soldier and water chestnut. So both of those species occur in areas where there's high boat traffic. So for example, the water soldier, primary occurrence of water soldiers in the Trent River east of in Peterborough, which is part of the Trent Severn Waterway. And it wasn't practical for us to require individuals to make sure they don't get a piece of that plant stuck on their boat when they're traversing the waterway. This recognizes that is inevitable and that would not be a contravention of legislation. There are requirements in the regulation that say, if you're moving that boat from the water, again, all vegetation has to be removed, again, for spread. With respect to the restricted species, so 4 of these are in Ontario. They are extremely common in southern Ontario and are being found more and more commonly in northern Ontario, unfortunately. But for these, the 2 species of dog strangling vine and Japanese knotweed. With respect to the prohibition, so again, these species can no longer be brought into Ontario. They can't be deposited or released. You can't grow them, propagate them, and you can't buy, sell, lease, trade, or trade these things. In addition, within provincial parks and conservation reserves, you can't bring them into, and there's no possession or transportation of these species in those areas. Is that there are a significant number of activities, both that result in the movement of these species, both either intentionally or unintentionally. So if the deposit or release occurs as part of a control or management activity, it's okay. So for example, so if you're out there doing an intentional control, and it results in deposit or release of seeds or parts of, that's not going to be a contravention. All if you're doing roadside maintenance, municipal drain maintenance, agricultural activities, that allows these species to be moved, deposit or released. Again, that's not a contravention of legislation. Obviously, we continue to work, both with our ministry partners as well as our other partners in terms of education awareness and the use of best management practices. So clean equipment protocol is a good example of that. Some general exceptions. So for emergency response activities, and it's fire police, not policy, and natural disasters. I really have to fix that. But essentially, if an activity, if they're undertaking an emergency response activity, then again, it would result in those prohibitions being contravened. We're not going to go after the firefighter or the police officer or anybody else who's involved in natural disaster response for moving invasive species. We also recognize that with incidental catch of fish, so especially now with grass carp being recognized in Lake Erie, the potential of individuals catching these as part of recreational commercial fishing activities. Don't want that to be them to be fearful that they're going to be in trouble. We want them to report those occurrences. Again, that is an exception to the regulation, as well as possession and storage of preserved specimens. So if it's a plant with non-viable seeds, or it's in a jar of alcohol, those can continue to be possessed and stored in Ontario. That's just a quick shout out to our partners again in terms of some of the materials that they've developed in partnership on behalf of the ministry. And then, these really are the partners that are frontline in terms of the education, awareness, and outreach to the general public and other stakeholders and partners going forward. EdMaps link again is the mechanism that we use for obtaining reports of invasive species in Ontario, and as the regulated list or the list of species of concern continues to grow, we are continually updating the EdMaps online and next slide is just me. So that's my contact information. Please, if there's any questions or comments, please feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'll do my best to help you out. I think, Kelly, are you going to open it up for...
Yeah. So thanks very much, Jeremy. That was really informative. And we have lots of time now for questions. We have 20 minutes. So please feel free to type your questions in again to the Q&A box. Just avoid the chat box if possible, but I will check it in case that happens. So I see a few questions starting to roll in. Again, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. Our first question is, does control or eradication powers extend to federal lands, including Indian reserves?
Easy question to answer. Generally, provincial legislation has limited jurisdiction on federal lands and federally rated reserve lands, but it does also depend on the nature of the activity that may be impeded by the provincial prohibition. So it's something that we work with our legal service advisors on a case-by-case basis in terms of if there's a desire or need to undertake activities in those areas. But as a general statement, provincial legislation does have limited, if not no jurisdiction in those areas. And those are circumstances where we work with the federal government to address concerns that may exist.
Thanks. So a question I saw earlier, just a general question. Any chance we can get a copy of the presentation? So the recording will be posted, and if Jeremy, if you're okay with it, we're going to post the presentation online as well with the recording, so you can get the presentation and the recording together there. So the third question is the same as the first, so similar to what was just asked. Does this act apply to federal land? So we just went over, and again, it will be recorded and posted. This next question is something I was going to ask. Have there been any prosecutions yet?
No.
No.
Just to add on, in terms of any new legislation that's introduced, there tends to be a soft approach to enforcement initially. So again, we still have a significant obligation to do education and awareness on the fact that this act is now out there, that there are now species that are regulated, and obviously if there are circumstances where enforcement officers do incur contraventions, they use their professional judgment in terms of whether or not the person just didn't know any better, or if it's a blatant, direct, aware contravention, and they'll use their judgment in those circumstances. But we haven't laid any charges under this legislation.
That's good to know. Actually, all these questions are something I was going to ask. The next one is, what plants might be on the next prohibited or restricted list?
The $1 million question. So I don't have a working list as of yet. I have been tasked to develop a bit of a public consultation piece to go out broadly and ask the public or stakeholders to prioritize what they think are the priorities in terms of regulating species under this legislation going forward. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to get something out on the environmental registry in the next couple of months, and really use that to inform next steps with respect to regulations. We do have a list of species that we are concerned about. So mountain pine beetle is an obvious one. There were no forest pests identified on the current list, so we are looking at forest pests as probably a high priority for the next set. As well as there's tench is a new one that has showed up in the St. Lawrence system that's moving into Ontario. So there's a couple ones that we're concerned about. But we are kind of seeking that general sense from the public, both in terms of is a desire for us to focus on species that aren't here, but we think are a high likelihood of coming, making sure they don't get here, or to try to use the regulations to manage some of the ones that are already here. And then we'll have to look at the regulatory effectiveness in those circumstances. But I don't have a magic list of 30 species at this point, but it is something we will be looking at forward.
Just at Environmental Registry, if you're not already signed up, you can just Google Environmental Registry for Ontario and you create an account. You can add certain alert words. You'll get an email when it comes through. I just find, we as a council find that helpful for anything that gets posted. We're notified right away. So just for a plug for OIPD, if you're interested, you can join our policy committee because we do comment on these documents as they come through. So the next question is, what is the mechanism, and you might have touched on it already, or forming a species added to the prohibited or restricted list?
So so the first step is we have to identify species. So what we have is there's potentially thousands of species that various groups and organizations and individuals would like to look at. So one of the first things we have to do is really prioritize what we want to look at first. And to be realistic, to go that risk assessment regulatory development process, it's not like we can deal with hundreds of species in a year. We're probably looking at groupings in the 20 to 30 range. Maybe if we can deal with families of species, we may get a few more. But in terms of, to have that science-based risk assessment done, we have to be realistic about how fast we can move forward. And to want to do that, I would, really take a look at that policy paper that I mentioned early in the slide deck that's available online in terms of the steps to do that assessment. And then if through peer review it's determined that that species poses significant risk to the natural environment, we would make the decision to recommend that species for regulatory consideration, develop the regulation, and put that through the government regulation process and public consultation process going forward.
All right. So the next question is, understanding you can include all species. Looking as Y isn't European on there, European buckthorn, sorry. Is there an intention to add or remove species, I guess, because we kind of just already talked about that.
Yeah. So again, the initial list was fairly focused in achieving some key objectives. So the least wanted list was a Premier's commitment back from 2013 to address those species, and those again are the ones that are in the prohibited category. And then the other ones are 4 species that really probably bulk of what we get in terms of requests or support requests from municipalities and other organizations to deal with. Going forward, yes, there is an intent to add more species, and to pick a species like buckthorn, what is common and widespread in Ontario, it really is that question of what difference would the regulation make, and that's part of that assessment process. So again, we could fail, is anybody really selling it? Prohibited possession, transportation of a species like buckthorn may actually create more challenges for people who want to control or eradicate it than beneficial. And those are all things we have to look at first in terms of prioritizing which species we really want to deal with, and then really looking at is a regulation the best mechanism to deal with that species. And again, I don't want to guess, but those are the type of questions we have to ask.
I know you don't remember the exactly, but just it is a good point that the initial list was based on that Great Lakes.
Yeah, it's on the Conference of Conference of St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers, and it was the aquatic least wanted list that they wrote back in 2013. So you can, if you Google that, you find their website, you can find the list, and as well as the news release that went out with that. And again, that list was jointly developed with the Great Lake U.S. jurisdictions, Ontario and Quebec, and the Premier at the time public commitment that Ontario would do something to address those species. So first list of species was really based on that commitment at this point. And that's why, and again, it wasn't a lot of public consultation or outreach leading up to this first list of regulated species, and that's why going forward we do want to be more, engage more broadly in terms of, what species do folks want us to deal with, and how they want us to deal with them in the regulatory sense.
Okay, so the next one is kind of similar to what we just talked about. Essentially is kind of like a living document, and then mostly you'll get it out through the EBR. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in terms of, if we're proposing a regulation, we have to there's both the Ontario Environmental Registry as well as there's a regulatory registry. Both of those are online, and we're legally obligated to post those documents to that, as well as send out notifications through our stakeholder groups. So I think we have the latest list is about 150 stakeholder groups that we would notify. And if you join the OIPC or sign into Kelly's newsletters, we typically notify them of a posting, so you could be aware ahead of time. In terms of where the actual list then sits in perpetuity, it is then part of the regulation, and so it can be accessed through e-laws. So again, if you Google the regulation number, so under Regulation 354-16, you can see the list, and as we continue to add species, that regulation would be updated with the new species going forward.
Is in regards to those plans or that you were talking about, do they include information about restoration depending on the species?
So as we work through the development of the first one, for the water soldier, we're kind of trying to figure out exactly what the scope and content of those plans will be. The key requirement is to make sure it's clear in terms of what actions would be in contravention, so the possession and transport, and the conditions on which you can then move a species without being in contravention. The broad aspect in terms of site restoration, I don't know if we'll get into that level of detail in the legal plan for the purpose of legislation, but what we'll probably do is plans reference existing documents, so BMPs or fact sheets or other documents that exist and be relevant to those activities that would help support the longer term, like once you remove something, preventing it from reestablishing. But I think at this point we're probably going to scope those plans just to the bare minimum legal requirements. But as we proceed the development of various plans for various species, that may evolve going forward.
Yeah, I'll go OIPC again. We have a number of best management practices, and we're updating them as we speak. So this is a good one. How any impacts to forestry practices? Is this at all related to the forestry management plan?
So it's not directly related to the forestry management plans. There is a general exception for legislation with respect to the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. So for example, if we wanted to remove trees as part of an invasive species control action, so again, my needle's easy to use. So if we found it in a stand of pine trees in the north and we wanted to remove those, we don't have to comply with basically some of the technical requirements around scaling, grading, measuring, etc. We can remove those trees for those purposes. We didn't link this into FMP practice at this point in time, but again, as we if and when we proceed to regulate forest pests or species that may be present in those areas and be impacted by those activities, again, those are things we can look at in terms of not only how we tailor regulatory prohibitions and conditions, exceptions to those for those circumstances.
Great. So this is a nitty-gritty one. If someone has restricted species on their property and they don't attempt control, can they call MNRF or a control officer to enforce control?
Yeah, so I should be clear too. One of the things I don't necessarily highlight in this deck is some of the order powers are limited for the restricted species, given the fact that they are broad, established in Ontario. So, for example, we can't use the invaded place order for Australian vine in Southern Ontario. We made a decision that that's not a tool that we want to use for that species because, from our perspective, it's going to create more fear or concern than it's really worth, and it's not sending the right message. In those circumstances, I would encourage folks to report them to the hotline to EDMAPS. For the restrictions in general, given how widespread they are, those aren't necessarily a priority for sending an enforcement officer out to take a look at. But again, we are working with partners and municipalities in terms of how we want to manage and deal with those species going forward. But again, I would encourage, report them to report occurrences to the hotline, so there is the data of that occurrence available to us.
Good one here. Does removal of invasive plants override the Pesticides Act and the restrictions?
No, so there's no exemptions or exceptions provided from the Pesticide Act for the Invasive Species Act. So all obligations or legal requirements that exist in that legislation still apply, and you have to follow all the requirements and processes that exist.
Okay, to know. We got one a lot. Can you elaborate on how the Canadian Food Inspection Agency are involved in this, as they were for EAB?
Yeah, Food Inspection Agency has jurisdiction for introduction of new species to Canada with respect to both forest pests and some plants. And so in terms of the legislative authority that they have, they are the lead for species that are non-native to Canada. So for Asian longhorn beetle is another good example. A species like mountain pine beetle, it's a native species to Canada, so it's not federal jurisdiction. It falls to the provinces to deal with. So for cases like emerald ash borer and where the federal government did decide to take action, and again we can debate for hours about how effective or whether the right type of action was taken. The province would look to them to take the lead. So the next species that is potentially of concern is oak wilt. And so right now we are in discussions with the federal government in terms of action they may take federally with respect to the introduction of that species into Canada, and then we'll look at our gaps or additional things we may want to do at the provincial level with respect to that species going forward. So it really is that jurisdictional line in terms of who's first, and then we kind of figure out how to work together going forward. Hopefully that helps.
Sure. So the next one I think we can answer easily is just a bit of confusion. So in the table on 14 or so of all the species, there's a lot of the aquatic species. So yes, the table is broken down into prohibited and the restricted species. There are more aquatic under prohibited due to what we were just talking about earlier with that list that was developed through the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll try and post something about that on our website. So yes, it does include the breakdown.
Yeah, so I fully realize there's a bit of a criticism there that the first list really was heavily focused on the aquatic side of things, and again, that was, as Kelly mentioned, because of the list that kind of predated the Act. And going forward, I think one of the areas we identified internally as a potential priority is forest pests, for example, as well as additional plant species. So as the list expands, I would expect it to become a little more generic in how it deals with the various taxonomic groups. But right now, I fully understand it does have a heavily aquatic focus.
Great. So these are great questions. Keep them coming. We'll put it off around 1. Will MNRF provide training to the municipal weed inspectors if they are invasive inspectors under the Act? Yeah,
so I don't want to understate the amount of conversation and work that would have to occur for that to actually happen, that we would delegate those authorities to inspectors. And yet, if we ever were to reach the point where that decision was made to delegate weed inspectors, then training would be provided going forward.
Great. I think in this, but again, for clarification, do you have the power to issue a stop work order, so like construction projects?
So yeah, so if the activity was out of compliance, so for example, if an enforcement officer stopped by a site and they were moving and regulated in species, that would be in contravention of the prohibitions, and yes, they could use that compliance order mechanism to stop that activity and require that person to take measures to make sure that they come into compliance with the Act.
And so we've touched on this a little bit, but do you have like a timeline at all for listing more species? I know that's a popular question.
Yeah, don't put it in stone or anything. So there's 2 dates. So Ontario has right now what they call the twice effective date with respect to regulations. I know in November we did pass the regulation. We had to seek an exemption from the twice annual effective date requirements. And so what that means is that typically we can only pass regulations in Ontario on January 1st and July 1st. We exception, and that was approved based on the fact that the Act was coming into force and we wanted species regulated when the Act came into force. I'm anticipating that we should be able to propose the next set of species for regulation for next January 1st. But given the fact that we're heading into an election year and the way government essentially shuts down a significant period of time before occurs, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get our package through the system. But again, that does require, in the next few months for us to kind of come up with the list, get the assessment work done, and regulatory proposal developed. But optimistic that we may be able to add species to the list next January. Again, that's just kind of open prediction at this point. There's nothing guaranteed at this point. And then we would probably get trying to add species kind of on an annual basis going forward as appropriate and required.
All right. So we're still going to keep going, but if I do miss questions, it's not because I'm ignoring them. We just are running out of time. We still have about 8 minutes though, and Jeremy's information is there. So if you have any questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to email him. The next one is, other than the best management practices, are any legal requirements that municipalities must undertake in regards to the restricted species? Any municipal interaction, I guess, or?
Yeah, I mean, so the one that was raised as the most significant concern was around roadside maintenance and municipal drain maintenance and the potential to move and cause the deposit release of those species. And so that is covered off under the exception. There is no requirement or obligation to actually go out and control or remove plants, both within a municipal context or a private land context. The Act is enabling it. It provides the ability to do that, but it doesn't require individuals, et cetera, to do that. But essentially, we're working kind of on that education awareness side, and that's why Kelly's been doing things like the municipal workshops to talk about how you deal with an invasive species removal strategy in your municipality. But again, there's no specific obligation, and if the concern really does relate around, okay, we're doing our general maintenance activities, exception is there, but obviously we are hoping folks can start to take advantage of the BMPs, the clean equipment protocols that exist out there to, again, reduce the likelihood or mitigate the movement of species as a result of their activities.
Apply to different regulations, maybe you can speak to that many invasive species come on boats, so what are the practices around shipping and species?
So the backwater regulations, so again, that is federal jurisdiction, so it is dealt with by the federal government. So the existing ballast water exchange requirements that are in place, those are put in place by the federal government, and they're dealt with by Navigation. I want to say sure that's the right company. There is a concern around they call acres, or the boats that move essentially from Ontario up to Lake Simcoe, or not Lake Simcoe, Lake Superior, and whether or not the province has any jurisdiction. And again, those are questions that we're working. There's a couple organizations that represent those large ship owners, and having conversations in terms of what else can be done. I know the federal government is looking at, again, what can be done with respect to those. It is an area that is generally a federal jurisdiction. At the provincial level, looking at the recreational water movement of watercraft, because that is something that falls in our provincial jurisdiction.
Great. So the next one is the other lists of invasive species and like listing, ranking them, because we do have that in the back of our landowner's guide. We kind of rank them based on their invasiveness. So does this present a contradiction to the list that you have?
Yeah, it's a challenge in terms of communication that, it's understood there's a much larger list of invasive species than what we currently regulated, and now essentially we have a list of, we have regulated invasive species, we have invasive species that aren't regulated, and then we have non-natives that some people may consider invasive and others not consider invasive. So there is some work on our end, to kind of clear the water in terms of what are regulated and how they're dealt with in the context of the legislation, and then what are invasive species and how they're dealt with in terms of the other mechanisms like best management practices, awareness, etc. That is something that going forward with the partners this summer in terms of awareness and outreach, we're really looking at highlighting the current list of regulated species to get that awareness out there, and how we deal with the longer list is kind of, start.
All right. So you mentioned that some prohibited aquatic plants are available in the aquarium trade. So have those vendors or any that you know of been notified about those species, like water soldier or parrot feather?
So we haven't done a direct outreach yet to individual vendor example, we did do a notification to kind of their provincial level organizations. So Jack from the pet industry side, and then through Landscape Ontario, kind of for the horticultural center guide side. I've been going back and forth with Landscape Ontario right now to try to arrange a meeting. We can kind of work with them again to get that more localized awareness, where we can either work to contact individual stores or vendors or other ways again. And we'll probably be looking at similar types of things with the OIPC and the OFH. Though there hasn't been that individual outreach yet. We've dealt with it at the provincial level, but again, going into the spring and the summer, we are needing to try to get to the individuals, and that goes back to the enforcement, which that if we haven't appropriately notified these individuals, it wouldn't be fair for us to show up with a hammer and start laying charges. Again, there's steps that we have to deal with going forward.
Is there a permit required when doing management of a restricted species?
Yeah, it depends on the nature of the activity. So if it would contravene and those prohibitions, then yes, an authorization would be required. I would think, so if we think back to those prohibitions, so you can't bring them into Ontario, you can't deposit or release unless it's as a result of a control or management activity. You can't propagate, you can't buy, sell, lease. So I think with the type of control or management activities, folks should be okay. I wouldn't expect that an authorization would be required. You're not intentionally propagating. I highly doubt folks are going to be bringing these into Ontario. Don't anticipate the need for authorizations for the restricted species. Okay.
So if the landowner has a restricted species on their property and it's spreading, all the neighbors around them have undertaken control, is there action that can be taken to compel that one person that's seen everything, no petted?
There's no direct the general answer is no. There is nothing you can really do to force an individual to take action, and I am aware of several circumstances where the groups are undertaking active control and eradication. There's one landowner that doesn't care, likes the plant, and it's messing up the program. But other things we really have to look at on a site-specific case, and in general for the restricted species, again, we're not going to use that invaded place order type of power. It's really an encouragement type approach, and I realize there's limits to that, but that's kind of the path forward that we've taken.
But as considering that dog strangling vine is on the noxious weed list through the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, weed inspectors do have the capability of enforcing one to remove DSB
if it's in an area that would impact agricultural activity
or horticulture.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a limit to that power, but yes, that is an additional option that does exist.
But DSB is the only restricted, like Medes and Japanese knotweed aren't on the noxious. Yeah. No. Okay. But there are other invasives on there, like wild parsnip and buckthorn, actually, which we've been seeing a lot of questions about. A loaded question: any funding coming our way for groups involved in species control?
So the current answer would be beyond what we have with the existing partnerships around with the Invasive Species Center, the OIPC, and the OFH. No, there is no. There's not in the sense of a stewardship fund like the one that exists under the Endangered Species Act at this point in time. That if the encouragement occurs, that maybe funding couldn't be available, but right now there is no additional funding at this point in time.
Okay, so I know it's one, so we have one last question. It's a good one, and again, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions. I do apologize. I tried to space them out a little bit. Please email Jeremy. So last but not least, you mentioned the possibility of CAs including in assistance inspections. If this came out, how would it work its way through Conservation Ontario and the individual CAs?
Yeah, to the approach, if we were to look at municipal weed inspectors or other individuals, again, it's something that we would have to open a conversation with Conservation Ontario and the individual conservation authorities to kind of, you want these individuals, or do we need these individuals to have that power? What role could they play with respect to the use of the inspection powers that exist under legislation? And then we have to kind of go through the process, because it would be a new power activity for CAs, and again, there would be costs and expectations that go with that. Again, that's something we have to work out on a go-forward basis in terms of how, yes, do we want to grant them the authority? How would that authority be used? How are those activities funded and supported? What training goes with that? There's a lot of questions with that. And so again, those are things that I think would be more of like a 5-year horizon, maybe, more than anything that was going to happen in the short term at this point in time.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for your questions. That was really great. Lots of good questions. And again, it will be posted either today or tomorrow. Stay tuned for registration of our next webinar. All right, take care.